Hello, Mr. Hardy here, and in this video I would like to teach you about Chapter 5 of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, titled Incident of the Letter. I'll start by recapping the plot of this chapter. We'll then explore the key characters, context, themes and quotes. You may want to commit to memory ahead of your assessment, and I'll leave you with an exam-style question that you can answer if you want to do some analytical writing practice. So, what happens in Chapter 5, Incident of the Letter? Well, Mr. Utterson goes to visit his friend Dr. Jekyll, and this is in relation to the murder of Sir Danvers Carew, which happened in the previous chapter. Now, Dr. Jekyll isn't in his main home, he is in his laboratory, his sort of side building, his outhouse. Dr. Jekyll claims that he is done with him being Mr. Hyde. So Dr. Jekyll is well aware, he's heard in the square people call out about the murder of Sir Danvers Carew, and he knows that Mr. Hyde is accused of doing it. And Dr. Jekyll claims that Mr. Hyde will never be heard of again. So at this stage of the novella, Dr. Jekyll seems to think he has control over Mr. Hyde. Dr. Jekyll then reveals that he has a letter and he doesn't know what to do with it, whether to give it to the police or not. So he hands it to his friend Mr. Utterson because he places a great trust in him. Now the letter is clearly signed by Mr. Hyde, and Dr. Jekyll claims it was hand-delivered to his property today. So there's no envelope, there's no return address that could be used to track Mr. Hyde. Mr. Utterson believes that Dr. Jekyll, his friend, has escaped the murderous intentions of Mr. Hyde. So Utterson asks Jekyll, who was it who wrote your will? Did Mr. Hyde force you to write the will? Now, of course, the will says that if Dr. Jekyll dies or disappears for more than 3 months, everything goes to Mr. Hyde. And rather begrudgingly, I guess, well, without using words, Henry Jekyll nods and suggests that Mr. Hyde forced him to write the will. And this leads Mr. Utterson to believe that Mr. Hyde forced Dr. Jekyll to write the will and was going to murder Jekyll in order to claim the inheritance, in order for the will to be executed. Dr. Jekyll doesn't really comment on this, but to Mr. Utterson, this is the logical sequence of events. So feeling a little bit better, Mr. Utterson actually leaves Dr. Jekyll's house. However, on his way out, he receives some confusing information. Utterson checks with Poole, who's Dr. Jekyll's butler, for a description of the deliverer of the message, and he's assuming the deliverer of the message would be Mr. Hyde himself, who's a small man who comes across as deformed. But Poole says that no message was delivered, no message was hand-delivered or dropped off today, otherwise he would have known about it. So this leads Mr. Utterson to think that the message was either dropped off directly to Jekyll in his laboratory, or maybe even written in that laboratory. So either Mr. Hyde was being sheltered by Dr. Jekyll in the laboratory, or worse still, Dr. Jekyll is forging a letter on behalf of Mr. Hyde. So, feeling not so good, Mr. Utterson returns home. And he talks to his head clerk. A clerk is like an office worker, an admin worker. His head clerk, Mr. Guest, who also happens to be a handwriting specialist. He's studied handwriting and is able to tell the difference between different styles of handwriting. So, Mr. Utterson shows Mr. Guest the letter, and Mr. Guest starts to analyse it. Just then, a letter appears from Dr. Jekyll. The letter is an invite, inviting Mr. Utterson over for dinner. Mr. Guest asks if he can look at Dr. Jekyll's letter next to Mr. Hyde's letter. And in doing so, Mr. Guest compares both the letters and comes to a conclusion that they are written by a similar hand, or maybe even the same hand. The only difference is a slight slant of the handwriting. Now, this is really interesting information because this suggests that maybe Dr. Jekyll has forged a letter on behalf of Mr. Hyde, or as readers, we know that it has a more sinister meaning, that these two characters are actually one in the same. It is written by the same hand, not just a similar hand. Obviously, at this stage of the novella, Mr. Utterson does not know that, so he goes to bed at night fearing the worst. He fears that his friend Dr. Jekyll has forged a letter so has signed a letter on behalf of someone else, and that someone else is Mr. Hyde, a murderer. Now, committing fraud, pretending to be someone else, is a punishable crime that would ruin Dr. Jekyll's reputation. But forging a document, committing a crime, committing fraud for a murderer, I mean, that is downright scandalous. That would ruin Jekyll forever. And that is how the chapter ends. So let's take a look at some key characters. We have Mr. Utterson. As we know, he is the detective in this detective novella, and he is also our narrator. So we get everything from Utterson's perspective. And he goes to visit Jekyll almost to question his friend. And this sort of line of questioning is what you'd expect from an inspector or an investigator or a detective. So this really puts him in that role as a detective narrator. Utterson also acts as a lawyer. He claims that both Carew and Jekyll are his clients, so he needs to protect both his client's reputation and do what is lawfully right in this situation. That being said, Utterson acts really as a friend. He wants to protect Jekyll more than anything, in particular Jekyll's reputation. So whilst he's a lawyer and he has to follow the law, he favours the idea of protecting Jekyll, of being loyal to his friendship to Jekyll and protecting Jekyll's reputation in particular. So basically, he's a really good friend. We also learn that Utterson is a sensible person. He realises he might be in over his head here, so he is resourceful. He gets help from an expert, and this happens to be his head clerk, Mr. Guest, who's an expert on analysing handwriting. We see Dr. Jekyll here. Stevenson describes Dr. Jekyll as looking deathly sick. So whatever's been happening recently, and we as readers know that Mr. Hyde has been murdering Sir Danvers Carew recently, this has led to Jekyll appearing very, very ill. Dr. Jekyll believes that he has control of Mr. Hyde and he can get rid of him. He says, "I swear to God, I will never set eyes on him again." Those of us who've read the novella know that this is not true. Dr. Jekyll trusts Mr. Utterson. "I have so great a trust in you." You can link this to the theme of friendship if you want. Dr. Jekyll lies to his friend. This would be an example of bad friendship. The note was handed in. When Mr. Utterson asks for the envelope, because obviously that would have Mr. Hyde's address and current hideaway, Dr. Jekyll lies and says the note was handed in. And when Mr. Utterson leaves Dr. Jekyll's property, he asks Poole who handed in the note, and Poole says nobody handed in any notes. So would a friend, Jekyll, lie to his other friend, Mr. Utterson? Really, he shouldn't. That's dishonourable, that's ungentlemanly, that would ruin their loyalty, their reputation. Basically, Dr. Jekyll is taking huge risks here on behalf of Mr. Hyde. Now, obviously, we know they're one and the same, but Mr. Utterson, who's narrating the story to us, doesn't know that at this stage. Dr. Jekyll claims he's learnt a big lesson. What a lesson I have learnt. That lesson you can interpret in many ways. Maybe it's a lesson to not experiment in transcendental science. Maybe it's a lesson in ethics and morality. Maybe it's a lesson in... There's a variety of different ways you can analyse that word lesson. But the most obvious one is he really regrets creating the potion that is splitting him and Mr. Hyde. Okay, we have Mr. Guest. I think this is the only chapter he appears in. He is Utterson's head clerk, so he has an office role, an admin role in Mr. Utterson's law firm. Mr. Utterson trusts Mr. Guest, so they have a friendship. You can link this to the theme of loyalty. There was no man from whom he kept fewer secrets than Mr. Guest. We learn that Mr. Guest is a student of handwriting. He's described as a great student, so that's someone who constantly studies and learns and gets better. That's a really good skill to have. And he's a critic of handwriting, so he's able to analyse handwriting, notice similarities, differences, things like that. Mr. Guest is also a man who gives advice. He's a man of counsel. He offers wisdom and advice. So overall, Mr. Guest is a really positive character. I wouldn't consider him a main character, but he facilitates the story. He gives us our first real clue that Jekyll and Hyde are one and the same by analysing the two letters and concluding that it is written by a similar hand. Okay, contextually speaking, this is where it gets interesting. You may have heard of a psychologist called Sigmund Freud. He was Austrian, and he was a neurologist as well as a psychologist. So he studied the brain, he studied the mind. He was born in 1856 and he died in 1939. And he came up with many ideas. I think one of his prominent ones is psychoanalysis. I could spend a whole video just talking about Freud, so I'll just boil down to the little bit that you need to know in relation to Jekyll and Hyde. Sigmund Freud came up with a theory called structural theory of the mind, and he proposed that the human mind is made up of three sections or three parts. A person's personality is made up of the Ide, the superego, and the ego. So the Ide is the primitive part of our humanity. For example, it's the part of us that desires to have sex, physical intimacy, or it's the part of us that is prone to violence. If someone insults you or insults someone you know, that initial gut reaction to want to punch or kick or shout or scream, that's what you'd call the Ide. It's primitive, it's instinctive, it's in all of us as human beings. And now the Ide, in an extreme form, is represented by Mr. Hyde. It is all of the base passions of humanity unleashed. The opposite of the Ide is the superego. The superego is using your morality, your conscience, your sense of right or wrong to regulate your humanity. So we can link this to the theme of being a gentleman, doing the right thing, being charitable, looking appropriate, behaving appropriate, having manners. Most of us, I'd like to think, would have a good superego. And this is represented by Dr. Jekyll. He is a doctor, he helps other people, he's a gentleman, so he appears moral, he appears correct, he throws parties for his friends, he's sociable, he helps with charitable works, he comes across as a moral part of humanity. He knows right from wrong and he does more right than wrong. He's got self-control. Now the ego is basically how you present as a person. It's the result of the battle between the Ide and the superego. So every human has this desire, according to Sigmund Freud, to want to go around and have sex and beat up other people. That's part of the Ide, that's part of our humanity. However, most humans, through their superego, their sense of morality, of right and wrong, are able to rein in that part of themselves and instead act in a way that is gentlemanly or has manners or what would be considered polite. And the ego is the battle between these two things and how you present. Are you more Ide-based? Are you more impulsive and reckless? Or are you more superego-based? Are you more in control and calm? Now, interestingly, the potion that Henry Jekyll creates splits the ego into the Ide, which is Mr. Hyde, and into the superego, which is Dr. Jekyll. And this is a really fascinating concept and links to the theme we're going to look at, which is duality. Dual means two, so duality means that something has two natures. So initially, Robert Louis Stevenson presents Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as two separate characters. This is really clear in the first half of the novella, the first 5 chapters. It's about now that Stevenson starts dropping hints to the reader that actually Jekyll and Hyde might be one in the same person split into 2 personalities, the Ide and the superego. As I mentioned, as the novella progresses, readers begin to learn that they're actually one in the same, and towards the end of the novella there's a big revelation of how Dr. Jekyll has used a potion to split himself into his good half, Dr. Jekyll, and his bad half, his base half, Mr. Hyde. So this poses a really interesting question that I think Stevenson is asking the reader. How can a person who appears so good, like Dr. Jekyll, have such a conflicting personality like Mr. Hyde? And more interestingly or worryingly, does everyone have this in them? If you look at some of the best people in history, Mother Teresa, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, did they have their inner Mr. Hydes in them as well? I guess the question could go the other way. If you look at some of the worst people in history, the Hitlers, the Stalins, the Mussolinis, did they have a Dr. Jekyll in them that was being suppressed? And if you take this question personally, are you more Dr. Jekyll? Are you more superego? Or are you more Mr. Hyde? Are you more your Hyde and your baseness? This quote is probably one of the most famous from the novella. Man is not truly one, but truly two, and it deals with this idea of duality. Going back to psychology and people like Sigmund Freud, you have the idea of bipolar disease or schizophrenia, having multiple personalities within a person. This is clearly a topic that fascinated Robert Louis Stevenson and is one of the main themes of this novella. Duality links well to the theme of good and evil. Of course, Dr. Jekyll represents good and Mr. Hyde represents evil. But the reason these two themes link well is good and evil is a duality in and of itself. I don't know if you've seen the yin-yang symbolism, but it's this idea that in the world there is always going to be a balance of good and evil. And in every good person there'll be a bit of evil, and in every evil person there'll be a bit of good. The other thing you can do with duality when you write an essay about it is you can look at other aspects of duality within the novella. So the most obvious one is the duality of personality, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde being two opposite persons or personalities within the same person. But you've also got the duality of setting. Dr. Jekyll lives in Cavendish Square, very respectable, very super-ego place to live. Mr. Hyde lives in Soho, very disrespectable, disreputable place, a typical place where the Hyde might live. You could look at the duality of science. Dr. Lanyon practices what you might call morally good science, superego science, whereas Dr. Jekyll practices transcendental, more base, more experimental, more Hyde science. You could fill in this blank for me, the duality of. There's many aspects in this book that deal with two or more facets or elements of the same thing. Duality is a really big concept within this novella. So, what are the key quotes you may want to commit to memory? Dr. Jekyll is described as looking deathly sick, so we begin to see him unravel and unwind as a character here. I swear to God I'll never set eyes on him again. Dr. Jekyll still thinks he has some control over Mr. Hyde, although we know that is just not true. If it came to trial, your name might appear again. Mr. Utterson says this to Dr. Jekyll, and he wants to protect his friend's reputation. So since reputation is such a big theme, I thought I'd include this quote. I have so great a trust in you. Dr. Jekyll says this about Mr. Utterson. You could link this to the theme of friendship or loyalty. That being said, immediately after saying this, Dr. Jekyll lies to his friend Mr. Utterson and says that the note was hand-delivered when it wasn't. He meant to murder you, you had a fine escape. So Mr. Utterson is being quite logical here. He's learnt that Mr. Hyde has forced Dr. Jekyll into writing that will, and he's putting two and two together, a bit like a detective does, and he goes, you meant to murder you, Hyde meant to murder you, lucky you, Dr. Jekyll, you've had a fine escape. To which Dr. Jekyll replies, no, what I've had is a lesson in not messing in things I shouldn't mess in, a lesson in the Hyde and the superego and the ego, a lesson in good versus evil, a lesson in morality. He's learned all kinds of lessons in this novella. I quite like this description. Mr. Utterson describes the letter as a murderer's autograph. Sorry, not autography, autograph, typo on my part. Henry Jekyll forged for a murderer. This is the last idea that Stevenson leaves us with in this chapter, and you could link this to reputation. So Mr. Utterson is shocked that Dr. Jekyll would forge for a murderer. You might even want to link this to duality. That puts Jekyll alongside Hyde, who is a murderer, and it's beginning to hint that they might be one in the same. You could link this with being gentlemanly, so forging or committing fraud would be very ungentlemanly. It's one of the key cornerstones of this chapter. So what can you do? You can make a note from this video on a physical copy of the novella, and you can try answering this exam-style question. How does Stevenson present Jekyll and Hyde in the first half of the novella? I think the main idea to capture is that he presents them as separate characters. So Henry Jekyll and Edward Hyde are presented separately. They live in separate properties in Cavendish Square and Soho. They appear different. Jekyll's quite a big character physically, Hyde is quite small and deformed. However, as the novella progresses, there are hints being dropped that they are actually one and the same person. You can bring in some contextual knowledge about Freud and about the Id represented in Mr. Hyde and about the superego represented in Jekyll. You could refer to this battle, you could link it to the theme of duality. Lots and lots of ways you can explore how to answer this question. So if you found this video, please give it a like, please subscribe to my Mr. Hardy YouTube channel for the rest of the Jekyll and Hyde analysis, and feel free to leave a comment if you think there's anything I've forgotten. Well, thank you for your attention, and I'll see you on the next one.